Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Adam Hudson here. Today is August 26th, 2025. It's another fireside chat style riff, solo episode, fireside chat style. Just chilling here. Well, chilling as much as possible. Um, just given all the fuckery going on in the world. Never ending fuckery. Um, but I'm here to talk about it and make sense of all the fuckery going on in the world. Anyway, uh, so there's a couple stuff I want to talk about. I don't want to go on too long, but hey, you never know. I could go on longer because I can talk a lot. Um, Especially about the fuckery of the world going on. But there's some stuff I wanted to. After I recorded the last riff, number 4, where I just ripped into Joe Budden. I don't want to totally reiterate it because at this point it's like, I guess like old news or whatever. Um, but something I was thinking about when I was looking through the comments, uh, there was something I wanted to mention that I didn't touch upon, but it's more like a larger media narrative cultural issue versus just something that's specific to Joe Budden. But one thing I noticed when I was looking at the people who push back on Joe Budden's reaction. So for those of you who probably didn't listen to that episode that I talked about, basically Mark Lamont Hill was on the Joe Budden podcast. He's now a regular. When Mark Lamont Hill mentioned Gaza and all of his Al Jazeera colleagues being killed by Israel in Gaza, the response from the rest of the people on the Joe Budden podcast was, to put it lightly, insensitive. Um, Joe Budden was like kind of cracking jokes, and basically it was like they were trying to figure out how to pivot. And so there's a lot of pushback, and so I pretty much everything I wanted to say I put in that episode. But one thing I noticed is that the audience, Mark Lamont Hill's audience, and the people who push back um, to the insensitivity of Joe Budden's response, I think they sort of missed the plot a little bit because most of the people were like, well, you know, you should have at least offered Mark your condolences, etc., etc. And um like obviously yes, offer condolences, but I think that misses the plot because Mark Lamont Hill's colleagues were murdered by Israel in the context of an ongoing fucking genocide that is being live streamed to American and Western and global audiences. Um, so these like journalists weren't just killed like randomly or happenstance. Israel killed Palestinian journalists in Gaza because Israel, as we speak, is reoccupying Gaza. And in fact, one thing I want to touch upon is that Israel is moving forward with its plans to uh, basically take over Gaza. Like Israeli troops have pushed deeper into Gaza City as of a couple days ago. So basically, Israel doesn't want Palestinian journalists to cover what it's doing. They don't want any witnesses. So I think the response to what Joe Budden said, I think Joe Budden should have done more than just offer condolences. That was an opportunity to talk about the fucking genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people, to fulfill Israel's greater aim of reoccupying Gaza and establishing a greater Israel throughout the Middle East. Um, and also, like, there are some people who even admitted that, well, they admitted to, like, feeling some sense of discomfort in talking about Palestine. And I think that's also problematic because I think the harm done to Palestinians outweighs any sort of discomfort, you know. Um, and I'll even dig. There's other stuff about Palestine that I'm going to talk about in this podcast, but I won't just talk about Palestine. There's a couple other things I want to talk about, but um, I think to truly stand in solidarity with Palestine, all Americans need to take a principled stance against U.S. imperialism and U.S. support for Israel. And that would, at minimum, entail sanctions and an arms embargo. So I think that, with Joe Budden's podcast, this also speaks to a deeper issue because this is the kind of deeper issue I wanted to raise as it relates to the state of media and journalism. And well, one small thing as it relates to the Joe Budden podcast, but then I'll mention the larger thing. But what also kind of pissed me off about the Joe Budden podcast, or the Joe Budden's reaction, is that his show feels like a minstrel act. Like, his reaction and the way he reacted, to me it sounds like, oh, this guy acts like a fucking minstrel. Just like basically being a fucking clown for white people's entertainment. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason why he cracked a joke about like how to pivot and shit. I just think the dude was, I mean, he's just ignorant. But that's also what part of like would rub me the wrong way, is that I just thought like this feels like just too much of a damn joke, and it feels like a minstrel act. But the larger issue I wanted to talk about, I was listening to this discussion with Emily Jasinski and Ryan Grimm of Breaking Points, and they were discussing the state of media and journalism, particularly with the rise of podcasts. And it was I thought it was interesting because, like, I do remember, like, in the 2010s, that's when I was doing a lot of my freelance journalism for several publications, mostly Truth Out, but a bunch of others. And one thing Ryan Grimm mentioned was that, people during that era actually read more, and we've kind of moved away from it, where it's true, a lot of media is disseminated and consumed through like these short, Instagram and TikTok reels. And also, in addition to that, the rise of these major podcasts. So Joe Rogan, Joe Budden, the Flagrant the Flagrant podcast with Andrew Schultz, Theo Vaughn, Tim Dillon, like all these sort of like podcasters who are, many of them come from the world of comedy. And Mark Maron, the comedian, did a good job of like roasting, like making fun of Theo Vaughn, and he's been pushing back against like a lot of these these like kind of basically Rogan sphere comedians who have become pretty political, and because it's true, they do have a political and cultural impact. So the question is, like, what they were talking about is, what does it mean to be a journalist? That's what Ryan and Emily were talking about. Is like, what does it mean to be a journalist today? And as they were talking, what got brought up is, the question was, do some of these like for lack of a better term, bro podcasters, do they have like some sort of journalistic responsibility, even if they themselves are not journalists? Which is true, they are not. That would include Joe Budden, Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, all these guys. Like, they're not journalists, right? But they obviously want to touch on political and social issues. And in addition to that, what didn't get talked about with the Ryan and Emily discussion is that just the amount of money these podcast guys draw in. Like, I think calling them podcasts may be underestimating how much money they're actually drawing in, because the money they make rivals that of, like, let's say, Democracy Now, you know? So the amount of money they draw in, these are pretty much like, you know, like a new form of news media, almost like miniature news outlets in a way, because of how much people watch them and tune in because they want to hear some like long rambling interview or just like some dudes talking, and then they talk about politics. So the question is, even if they themselves are not journalists, do they have like some sort of responsibility to uphold journalistic ethics when it comes to talking about certain issues, particularly political and social issues that are outside of their realm of expertise? So, you know, they may not have to follow the exact like journalistic ethics. Like, they're not reporters, right? But I do think, my opinion, I think the answer is yes. They do have some sort of responsibility to uphold some sort of ethics. Maybe not journalistic ethics, like in terms of being a reporter, but they need some form of like intellectual ethics, that if they're going to wade into, like, I'll use Joe Budden, for example. Joe Budden is clearly not a journalist. He does not make himself out to be, but he has someone like Mark Lamont Hill who is, because Mark Lamont Hill is on Al Jazeera. And so I do think that everyone else, except for Mark Lamont Hill, like, if they want to make like that show work where they talk about quote unquote intellectual stuff, or like, well, specifically what they mean about intellectual stuff is they want to talk about politics and what's going on in the world. Now, I do think, like everyone else on the Joe Budden podcast, particularly Joe Budden himself, I do think they have some bare minimum of responsibility of doing their due diligence to do their own research and maybe come up with some questions to ask Mark Lamont Hill when it comes to what's going on in the world. So I think like they have that bare minimum responsibility, which I think in that episode that got a lot of pushback, they didn't hold that up. So the same thing that I say about Joe Budden applies to Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Nelk Boys. These guys are clearly not journalists, but they have significant cultural and political impact, and what they say has impact on millions of people in terms of their consciousness and what they think of the world. So they do have some sort of responsibility to have some sort of ethics when it comes to research and being fact-based versus just saying whatever the fuck they want and not having to think about it, people pushing back on them or people calling them out when they're fucking wrong. So basically my main point is, if these sorts of podcast dudes if they're going to keep touching on politics, social issues, cultural issues, if they want to do like political, social, and cultural commentary, they need to follow some media news ethics. That's what I think. And I don't think that they're doing a good job of that. So, going back to the latest news in Palestine, you know, another thing that this makes me think is, actually, well, there's a poll. Let's see. I'll talk about this poll first, and then I'll touch on what I also want to say. I just right before I started recording, I just saw this pop up in my Instagram feed from the Middle East Eye. The title is "Vast Majority of Israelis Believe There Are No Innocents in Gaza," says poll. A poll conducted by an Israeli organization has revealed that the vast majority of Israeli Jews believe that there are no innocents in the Gaza Strip. ACORD, a research group linked to Hebrew University specializing in social psychology, said 76% of the Jewish public partially or fully agree that there are no innocents in Gaza. The survey found that even among Israeli opposition voters, 47% fully supported the claim, while among Jewish opposition voters, a majority also agrees with the claim. Researcher Ron Gerlitz described the results of the survey as, quote, difficult findings, end quote, that indicate attitudes that fed into acceptance of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. These findings can, of course, shed light on the enormous number of Palestinian civilians killed in the war in Gaza, he wrote on X. It is important for me to write that agreeing with there are no innocents is not the same as we need to kill everyone there. It's not the same thing, but the consciousness of there are no innocents is the toxic soil that grows dynamics and actions that cause the killing of innocents. Anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab sentiment in Israel has been growing in recent years, targeting both Palestinians in the occupied territories and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Yep, that's another thing. There are people of Palestinian ancestry who are citizens of Israel, but they're not treated the same. They're not afforded the same rights as Israeli Jews. So, I think if you've been paying attention, this is not that surprising, but it's still pretty fucking damning. The majority of Israelis believe that they don't believe there are innocent people in Gaza. Like, the vast majority of Israeli Jews believes that there are no innocent people in Gaza. One thing I've been thinking about when it comes to Americans and how the American public relate to the dirty work of their empire, I think for the most part, a lot of Americans are deliberately kept in the dark about the dirty work of U.S. empire, especially when a lot of it is done by like the CIA and JSOC and basically those particular elements of the American imperial apparatus. A lot of their operations are covert and classified. So there's layers of secrecy to get some of the details out about like the dirty shit that the CIA and JSOC have been doing. Until it's like, 30 years later and then the CIA admits like, okay, yeah, like we did this dirty shit, but like, it was all for the greater good. And then usually when they release it, like people just stop fucking forgetting about it, and it gets to the point where it's like, the CIA could, let's say, like, for example, which is what they did, I think around 10 years ago, they did admit that they knew that some of the, particularly in the 80s, the Contras in Nicaragua, the CIA knew that many of the Contras were drug traffickers in the 80s. So, and that played a role in the crack epidemic in the 80s that largely hit black communities. So the crack epidemic in the 80s was spurred by essentially cocaine coming in from Colombia through Central America to inner cities in the United States. And the Contras, who were anti-communist, they were fighting against the left-wing Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The Contras were basically a CIA creation. They were funded and supported, armed, and essentially created by the CIA. A really good book I recommend is called Killing Hope. Talks about this stuff, particularly the CIA's and the Contras. But the CIA did admit, I believe, it was in an Intercept article, I believe, that the CIA knew that a lot of the Contras were drug traffickers, and they were engaging in trafficking to raise money for their war against the Sandinistas, because there was a Boland Amendment in the U.S. that got passed in the 80s, and that was basically curtailing direct U.S. funding to the Contras, and so the Contras had to find another way to raise money, and the way they did it was through drug trafficking. So when the CIA admitted that, like, that was like over 30 years later, and at that point it's like people forgotten about it, they stopped paying attention. It's like, oh, it's over now, So I think that's a huge reason why, like, I think Americans in general struggle grasping the damage of their empire, largely because they're deliberately kept ignorant of it. And also, like, I think the American public is sold, like, these myths of America spreading democracy around the world and all that stuff and blah, 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 blah. But I do think the tide is turning because more Americans are seeing images of dead Palestinians, and at the very minimum, I think, even if a lot of Americans are ignorant, like, when you show them, most Americans, the grim reality of American empire, like in images and shit, especially once you see like dead children and stuff, there are enough when they look at that, they're like, oh my God, why the fuck are we doing this? So contrast that with, like, the vast majority of Israelis. Basically most Israelis, like, it's safe to say that a lot of them just like lack a conscience. Like, they have just, the most Israelis have, like, deeply just deeply just blatantly accepted anti-Arab racism, like anti-Arab sentiment, as it says in this article. It's been growing in recent years, and it's normalized now. So another reason why the U.S. shouldn't support Israel is this. Also, another thing, this also came up in recent news in 972 magazine. This came out like August 21st, so a couple days ago to like last week. And, there are Israeli human rights activists and Israeli journalists who call out Israel's war crimes and its brutality, but unfortunately, they are a minority within Israel. 972 magazine is one such example of that. And in this article, the headline is, what this article shows is that, and here's the headline: Israeli army database suggests at least 83% of Gaza dead were civilians. Classified intelligence from May reveals Israel believed it had killed some 8,900 militants in its attacks on Gaza, indicating a proportion of civilian slaughter with few parallels in modern warfare. And the article goes, data from an internal Israeli intelligence database indicates that at least 83% of Palestinians killed in Israel's onslaught on Gaza were civilians. An investigation by 972 magazine's Local Call, and The Guardian can reveal. Figures obtained from the classified database, which records deaths of militants from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, contradict by a huge margin the public statements of Israeli army and government officials throughout the war, which have generally claimed 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio of civilian to militant casualties. Instead, the classified data backs up the findings of several studies suggesting Israel's bombardment of Gaza has killed civilians at a rate with few parallels in modern warfare. The Israeli army confirmed the existence of the database, which is managed by the Military Intelligence Directorate. Multiple intelligence sources familiar with the database said that the army views it as the only authoritative tally of militant casualty figures. In the words of one of them, there's no other place to check. So, according to the data, the Israeli army believed it had killed around 8,900 operatives since October 7th. The deaths of 7,330 of whom were considered certain, and 1,570 recorded as probably dead. The vast majority of them were junior, with the army suspecting it had killed 100 to 300 senior Hamas operatives out of a total of 750 named in the database. Okay, and then so this is the paragraph right before that. Um, the database includes a list of 47,653 names of Palestinians in Gaza whom Amman, that's the Hebrew name for the military intelligence directorate, considers to be active in the military wings of Hamas and PIJ, according to those sources. The list is based on the group's own internal documents acquired by the army. The database designates 34,973 of the names as operatives of Hamas and 12,702 as operatives of Islamic Jihad. A source familiar with the database explained that a specific piece of intelligence is attached to the name of every operative on the list whom the army is sure it killed, justifying the designation. The overall death toll published daily by the Gaza Health Ministry do not distinguish between civilians and militants, but taking the militant casualty figures obtained from the internal army database in May and lining them up against the health ministry's death toll. So basically comparing the Israeli army database of people killed with the Gaza Health Ministry's total death toll. It continues. The article continues. It is possible to calculate an approximate civilian casualty ratio for the war up to 3 months ago, when the death toll stood at 53,000. So basically, they're comparing the death count counted by the Israeli military with the numbers provided by the Gaza Health Ministry. Assuming that all of the certain and probable militant deaths were counted in the death toll, that would mean over 83% of Gaza's dead were civilians. If the probable deaths are discounted and only the certain deaths included, the proportion of civilian deaths rises to more than 86%. So basically, they're comparing. Okay, so it doesn't need. So they're comparing the numbers from the Israeli military database of Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives, and then within that number, the operatives who were killed, which is around, according to the Israeli military, they had killed around 8,900 operatives since October 7th. Okay, so basically according to the Israeli military, Israel killed 8,900 Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives. Okay, then compare that with the death tolls by the Gaza Health Ministry, and keep in mind, like given that Israel has destroyed so much of Gaza's civil infrastructure, from schools to hospitals, like the number of Palestinian dead could be much higher. But they're getting like the best numbers they can get from the Gaza Health Ministry. So compare basically 8,900 operatives to like the 53,000 deaths that recorded by the Gaza Health Ministry. So as it says, taking the militant casualty figures obtained from the internal Israeli army database in May and lining them up against the Gaza Health Ministry's total death toll, it is possible to calculate an approximate civilian casualty ratio for the war up until 3 months ago, when the death toll stood at 53,000. And look, it's probably more, because like there are people who are buried in the rubble. There's like people who are dodged on the ground, and people who've been doing the work on the ground like can point out that to confirm the total number of civilian deaths in Gaza. Like it's very difficult. Is difficult to find a lot of people, so the number could be higher. But so basically compare essentially the best numbers we can get, 53,000 to Israel's death count of Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives, which is 8,900. just from hearing those numbers, 53,000 to nearly 9,000, like that's a big ratio. So basically, when you that ratio is essentially over 83% at least of Gaza's dead are civilians. So, the intelligence sources explain that the total number of militants killed is likely higher than the number recorded in the internal database, since it did not include Hamas or Islamic Jihad operatives who were killed but could not be identified by name, Gazans who took part in fighting but were not officially members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, nor political figures in Hamas such as mayors and government ministers whom Israel also considers legitimate targets in violation of international law. However, that does not necessarily mean that the ratio of civilian casualties is lower than calculated above. In fact, it could be even higher. There you go. Recent studies have suggested the health ministry's death toll, which currently stands at around 62,000, is likely a significant undercount of the total number of casualties from Israel's onslaught, possibly as many as several tens of thousands. So that means the ratio could be even worse, essentially. So this article goes on. I think it's worth reading, but basically the gist of it is that the vast majority of Palestinians killed in Gaza by Israel are civilians. So when people want to still frame this as like some even-handed war against Israel and Hamas, like these numbers show that that's complete bullshit. Like Israel is just annihilating Palestinian people. So, which also, like I said, Israel's pushing further into Gaza City. This also ties into another article, something I just heard in the news recently, that I'll share. So the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, there were 2 resolutions that were put forward. There's a meeting with the Democratic National Committee. The DNC chairman is Ken Martin. And hold on, let me find, where's this? The fuck? Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry. This other article is loading. So, so today's Tuesday. So this meeting was Tuesday morning. It was a DNC summer meeting in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and there were 2 resolutions, both of which got voted down, and they're basically calling for pretty much the same thing, essentially cutting off U.S. aid to Israel. These are joint resolutions, but kind of the language was different. So, or the demand was different. One resolution called for the suspension of military aid to Israel. Another one called for an arms embargo against Israel. And both resolutions failed to pass. And even though the majority of the American public and the majority of the American base support cutting off aid to Israel and are critical of Israel's actions, the DNC still can't bring itself to do the right thing. And this is in a CNN article. I wanted to mention this because I just thought this is like, given off of what I just mentioned about the majority of Palestinians killed by Israel were civilians, the critique of the resolution is just like looks even more fucking ridiculous. Critics of Martin's resolution said that in an effort to treat both sides equally, the proposal failed to address the scale of Israel's. This is a CNN article, by the way, on the issue. The proposal failed to address the scale of Israel's response to Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack. Those opposed to the progressive-backed resolution say calling for an arms embargo goes too far, and the proposal doesn't mention the October 7th attack. Israel's supporters within the DNC have meanwhile sought to strike a middle ground between condemning Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government and still advocating for military and financial support for Israel. Democratic majority for Israel. Oh my God, Jesus. Democratic majority for Israel President Brian Romick called the progressive back resolution a flawed, irresponsible resolution at a Democratic National Committee meeting that will further sow division within our party and do nothing to help to bring an end to the Israel-Hamas war, and called on the resolutions committee to reject it. This is that's fucking ridiculous. Like, at this point, it should be fucking clear that this is not about Hamas, and it's not about October 7th, and this isn't about the hostages, because at this point Israel would have done what it can to what it could to rescue the hostages. I mean, like, there is I believe I mentioned it I think in our the episode we did right around October 7th, Peter and I, there is Operation Entebbe. Well, it's officially codenamed Operation Thunderbolt, but it was in 1976. It was an Israeli counterterrorism mission in Uganda. It was in response to a hijacking of a civilian airplane operated by Air France, and it was, I believe, it was flying from, I believe, the destination. Well, it's between the cities of Tel Aviv and Paris, and during a stopover in Athens, the airplane was hijacked by two Palestinian PFLP members and two German Revolutionary Cell members, and they had diverted the flight to Libya, then to Uganda, where they landed at the Entebbe International Airport. And basically the Israel, launched a counterterrorism raid that was actually, I'm looking at so I want to remember I'm trying to remember the hostage. Yeah, it was successful. Actually, wait, hold on. Sorry. So I want to get the actual details on the Entebbe raid, because I'm blanking on the Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah, here's like a Britannica summary of it. All 7 of the militants were killed. 11 MiG fighters supplied to Uganda by the Soviet Union were destroyed. The Israelis lost 1 soldier and 3 hostages during the operation. Okay, yeah, that was the aftermath. So it was successful. It's just like, okay, yeah, that's what I was looking at, because there were 3 hostages who were killed, but it was successful in rescuing the other hostages. So I pointed at the Entebbe raid because I had to look through and refresh my memory on the details. But basically, like, it was a raid where Israel successfully rescued hostages from an airplane. So, like, if Israel's main concern was the hostages, they didn't need to do this massive fucking ethnic cleansing. So, in Israel, the Israeli officials are pretty clear about their genocidal intentions in Gaza. So that result from the Israel supporters within the DNC was just fucking ridiculous. Anyway, there's a couple things I wanted to mention. I mean, Trump also wants to send more National Guard troops. Well, actually, with that, it's two updates. One, National Guard troops in D.C. are now armed, so they're literally armed soldiers patrolling Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And now Trump is looking at sending National Guard troops to other cities like New York City, Chicago, San Francisco. Like, this is basically putting, I mean, fascism is already here. And he's using he's expanding, basically what Trump is doing, he's expanding the use and definition of national emergency to justify his actions. And I think this is really similar to how the language of terrorism during the War on Terror was used to justify things like torture, indefinite detention, mass surveillance, and overseas targeted killing / assassination. So, for example, the term associated forces was basically a term that particularly Obama administration lawyers used to expand the scope of the 2001 authorization for use of military force, to basically expand the scope of the war on terror to include terrorist groups who were not responsible for 9/11 but were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So even the term associated forces was not in the original AUMF. So this Trump's authoritarianism does not come in a vacuum, because basically, like, if the U.S. can get used to and has gotten used to expanding definitions of terrorism to justify policies like torture, indefinite detention, mass surveillance, and assassination, then what Trump is doing is just basically a lot like the next logical step from that, expanding the use of the term national emergency to cover whatever the executive branch wants, which is exactly how, the language of the 2001 AUMF was used and then expanded to basically expand the scope of the global war on terrorism. So, that's one thing that comes to mind when I think about like what Trump is doing, that this didn't come completely out of nowhere, as horrific as it is. A couple of things I wanted to mention. Oh, I think actually some good news. Well, actually, first, let me mention this GQ article about the left and weightlifting, and then close it out with Africa. There you go. We'll do it that way. There's this really interesting article in GQ magazine. The title is Why Leftists Are Suddenly Lifting More Weights. I feel like I could do like a deeper dive on this in terms of the politics of lifting weights and how both the left and the right have used weightlifting. Because, like, yeah, there is a history of fascists promoting perfect body aesthetics in weightlifting to further the cause of fascism. And I actually think we're seeing a new iteration of that with the Trump era. But there's also a heritage of the left embracing weightlifting as part of the class struggle. It's something I want to dive more into, but I wanted to like read a bit from this article and share my thoughts, and then talk about Africa, and then close out there. If Donald Trump's first term was marked by a rise in skepticism of vaccines and mainstream medicine sparked by the pandemic, but fanned by the president himself, remember when he suggested injecting bleach, his second term has seen the very pursuit of health become right-coded. Trump won that second term in the podcast selection, so-called thanks to his interviews with Sean Ryan, Aiden Ross, and of course Joe Rogan, manosphere media entities that often feature more often feature discussions of MMA and biohacking than American politics. Once in office, Trump appointed as Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy, a health mystic who loves nothing more than to be seen working out in jeans. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's campaign to make the U.S. military more, quote, lethal has involved an emphasis on physical fitness and plenty of photo ops of him pumping iron with troops. Together, Kennedy and Hegseth have teamed up to launch the Pete and Bobby Challenge, a campaign in which they encourage Americans to do 50 pull-ups and 100 push-ups. In July, Trump announced he's planning to host a UFC fight on the White House lawn. Meanwhile, a broad swath of libertarian to far-right influencers and podcasts have made fitness, particularly muscularity, key to their brands. The YouTubers Logan and Jake Paul have spun their reputation as infamous enfant terrible vloggers to equally bombastic and equally fit stunt boxers. Andrew Tate has made his muscled physique central to his misogynistic content. All three of them have been vocal in their support of Trump. This connection between male fitness and far-right politics is far from just aesthetic. Researchers have uncovered fascist groups recruiting through gyms. The Canadian Broadcast Corporation recently published a large investigative piece tracking the rise of far-right active clubs that are training young men for violence and, per the report, increasingly moving from online forums to real-world training groups and anti-immigrant protests. Nearly a year since Trump's presidential win, as the left and Democratic Party continue to ask how they lost so many young men to the right, some are turning their attention to the gym. Leading leftist influencer Hassan Piker is famously jacked. Democratic candidates have started posting videos of themselves working out while talking policy. Meanwhile, the scramble to sway his voting group has even spurred Democratic operatives to launch a $20 million study called Speaking with American Men. Can Democrats and the left find the winning message they desperately need to attract young men at the squat rack? One thing I think, they are conflating the Democratic Party with the left, because the Democratic Party is not a left-wing party, is basically right of center when it comes to actual policy. So, that's something to keep in mind. Now, this is important. This is what I wanted to get at. Lifting hasn't always had such an obvious link to right-wing politics in America. During the Civil War, socialist weightlifters organized and fought for the Union across the North in German immigrant enclaves. One such group, the Turners, organized gyms and advocated that a balance of body and mind was needed to advance social justice. As Devin Thomas O'Shea writes in Jacobin, back in the 19th century, it was the left that was politicized and exercised. In post-revolutionary Russia, the new Soviet man was meant to be well-read and well-built. The 1960s saw the rise of muscle magazines, pictorial offerings of scrawny and bare men, ostensibly for a health and fitness-minded audience, which were shared in the gay community at the start of their fight for civil rights. But little by little, as the old left, rooted in the New Deal labor unions and blue-collar workers, gave way to the new, the left's connection to muscularity atrophied. Basically, the old left was more rooted to blue-collar labor, blue-collar workers, and basically manual labor. So, that type of manual labor did emphasize physical strength to do that work. And as the Democratic Party moved away from labor unions to white-collar professionals, there's less of a connection between the left and muscularity, basically, which I think is true. I think that's a good point that's mentioned in this article. It continues, within the living memory of a generation older than us, being in a union, being organized in your workplace, and working at the steel mill, that was a clearly, intractably, inarguably left-wing political orientation that was attached to a robust male identity, says Joshua Citarella, an artist who researches online political subcultures and hosts the Doom Scroll podcast. That political identity started to crumble in the 1970s and 1980s as deindustrialization gutted blue-collar professions and shifted the American worker from the shop floor to the cubicle. The result was, according to According to Citarella, the rise of the urban professional as the core constituency of the Democratic Party, and people who work in the manufacturing belt leaving their union and leaving the Democratic Party. Yep, 100% right. Um, the political connotations of muscularity have since seesawed over the decade, but since Trump's 2016 election, lifting and extremism have become entwined, argues Aspen Vera Mulvey, PhD, a University of Michigan anthropologist who has studied the connections between American fascist groups and gyms. You are easily able to find just on YouTube white nationalist lifting bros, she says. They're all over the place. It goes on. One of the reasons fitness and muscularity have become such a strong right-wing talking point, says Dr. Mulvey, is that it provides a version of what masculinity ought to look like, acting as a convenient foil to trans femininity, to femboys, to this fear of a weakening state of American muscularity. I think that strength in this kind of rhetorical arena is imagined as a perfect defense. Basically, yeah, and actually I think that's like a reactionary way of looking at weightlifting and masculinity, because like there's this really interesting video essay on and I'll link it. It's basically about Japanese fascism and like aesthetics bodybuilding, but it was kind of similar. Basically that essentially like the right wing conservatives, like their idea of masculinity, like they basically don't like femboys, basically. And that also connects to homophobia and transphobia, that like they see, like gay men or men who are effeminate as inherently weak, and too weak to defend like a strong nation and strong society. Now, like, I want to be careful here. I think desiring to be strong, to be of service to your community is not a bad thing. And I don't think is inherently reactionary. But I do think that like when you place its hierarchy, then it gets reactionary. Which is that like basically saying, oh, femboys, like they're at the bottom, like they're weak, they're pussified, they're blah 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 blah. Like that kind of line of thinking is right wing. It continues. This success is more than just rhetorical. As Dr. Mulvey's research found, it has also helped to build community based on shared devoted repetition and collective embodied connection. But Dr. Mulvey doesn't see strength and muscularity as irreversibly right-coded. Fitness is redeemable or an interesting kind of prospect for the left when it is performed in a similar manner, when people are coming together. Yeah, that's true. Like fitness, it does build community. A handful of leftist influencers have similar theories to test. Stephen Goldberg, better known as Young Chomsky, is a producer of the popular left-wing podcast True or Non and a veteran bodybuilder. For years, he's noticed a generally conservative bent to fitness culture. He recalls seeing a poster with the phrase liberal tears at a gym where he worked. After that, he began stumbling upon bodybuilding's right-leaning connections more frequently. He soon learned of CrossFit's deep roots in the military community, a group that mostly leans right on politics. Then he discovered that the author of Starting Strength, a foundational weightlifting training book, had embraced right-wing politics. This is true. I think this doesn't get mentioned enough, what it says right here, CrossFit's deep roots in the military community. I think that's part of the reason why weightlifting, strength training links further right wing, is because it definitely appeals to members of law enforcement and the military community. So I think that's actually a pretty significant connection that I don't think gets mentioned as enough as it should be when people talk about that sort of like, I guess you could say like right wing pipeline from combat sports and weightlifting to the far right. I think part of that pipeline has to do with basically, because there's also fitness tests to be in the military, like even like particularly once you're talking about like, let's say Navy SEALs and Special Operations Forces and law enforcement, they do have fitness tests. So to be a member of the law enforcement and the military, you do have to pass like a fitness test. And quite a bit of that fitness does have to do with strength training, particularly upper body strength. So, th- th- so that right there, like, a lot of people in the military and law enforcement, they're going to be drawn to weightlifting and strength training, and that can also, I think, shape the culture, the overall culture of weightlifting and combat sports. Um, because like I think, I would suspect that like maybe in some fantasy for some cisgender guys who join, maybe go to the gym or like want to get buff. I think part of, maybe for some of them, I don't want to say all of them, but I would imagine for some of them, they would aspire to be like, I'm like a tier 1 operator type of shit. So I think that's part of like some fantasy, particularly for people who are like really conservative. Like they, even if they're not in the military, they're like, I I wish I was, man. Like I could have joined the military, but I didn't. But like, I'm gonna train with a Navy SEAL. So there is definitely overlap between the military community, law enforcement community, and the culture of weightlifting and combat sports. And I think that definitely uh, shapes the politically conservative right wing trajectory of weightlifting and combat sports. Um, uh, Goldberg's lifting buddies over the years did not often see eye to eye with him on national issues. These people had different politics, he says. I didn't really care at the time. We're not talking about Democrats or elections. We're here talking about deadlifts and squats. Goldberg sees conservative political culture as the water you're swimming in at the gym. Since then, he has also encountered fellow leftists who are wary of weightlifting for fear that a built physical form might signal something politically problematic. People will tell you that getting built is an inherently fascistic idea, Goldberg says. I think, yeah, I think that's a sentiment within the left that I think that some people in the left like aren't honest with themselves about. I think there is like kind of like a subconscious fear that if you are in any way kind of like yoked or whatever, that it's fascistic. And I do think that the fascism has like co-opted, you know, strength training aesthetics for their own purposes. So the left looks at that and it's like, we don't want to touch that. Um, and this is the next paragraph. Like, I think is good. He doesn't think perversion of fitness at the hands of fascists should be understated. I agree. Yeah, it's not understated. But he also sees value in cultivating a culture of physical fitness on the left, and not just because it's healthy and good for you. This is the time when the left is not organized or in power, and there's definitely, I think, something to be said for struggling in the gym as a way to learn how to struggle in other realms in a broader sense towards a better world, Goldberg says. That is something I absolutely believe in. I myself, I 1000% co-sign that. I also think, like, given that this current culture of the far right, since they are embracing strength training, and part of their fantasy is like to crack the heads of people who are weaker than them. I think to fight back against that, I think the left needs to have its own strength and fitness culture, partly as a means of like protection and survival, like when shit hits the fan. Because I don't think it's a good thing for the left to be out muscled by the right wing. So I'm not going to read anymore, but I pretty much got the gist of it. I'll put the article in the show notes. But I think it's pretty good. As I broke it down, there's a lot of stuff I agree with. And there's more I can flesh out. Anyway, I'm getting close to an hour within this podcast, so this will be like the kind of last part that I want to talk about, particularly about Africa, and then I'll close out. Two things. One, make sure I got my notes here. Okay, yeah, so some good news, and then like I thought something interesting, particularly with the slave voyages database that I wanted to touch on. this won't take too long, like a couple minutes, and then close out. Um, Burkina Faso and Niger, they got rid of French as their official language, and they're switching to the indigenous languages of those countries. So, Burkina Faso, uh, whom this podcast is named after Thomas Sankara, the famous revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. Hold on, let me. Yeah, hold on, let me. Yeah, okay. Oh, I remember this. This kind of happened a while ago, but a friend of mine told me about it. Yeah, it was also Mali as well. So Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they're quitting a group of French-speaking nations. So basically, this is in Le Monde. Uh, it was quitting an international group of French-speaking countries. Um, yeah, so they're moving. They're basically moving away from French being their official languages. So, if you do a quick Google search, for example, Burkina Faso, the languages of Burkina Faso. Here, I'll give you guys kind of go through the indigenous languages. So, Mende, Gur, Hausa, Tamashek, Western Plains, Dogon. Those are among the major. Oh yeah, I think. Oh, even Wikipedia updated. Okay, yeah, because those countries. Let me look at the. Hold on, because I was just looking at. Oh, okay, yeah. Even if you go on Wikipedia, if you look at these countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, they basically demoted French as their official language, and basically French is like second official language. But for example, okay, like in Niger, the national language, well, their official language is now Hausa, and then they have other national languages like Fulfulde, spoken to Fulani people, Arabic, Hausa, Tamashek, uh, Songhai. It's going through Wikipedia. Um, yeah, if you look through the languages, um, yeah, on Mali's Wikipedia languages of Mali, if you look at the Wikipedia page, African French is like a semi-official language. Yeah, so basically all these countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they demoted French as a official language. They basically demoted it from official language to like semi-official, but the official languages they switched to the indigenous languages. And so in Mali, the official languages are Bambara, Dogon, Fola, Arabic, Meninke, Songhai, Tamashek, Soninke. So, um, and Bambara, Tamashek, Soninke, Songhai, those are among the many indigenous languages. So essentially, um, those countries have switched to their indigenous languages as the official languages of those countries, which I think is awesome because I think that's just like, yeah, those are the languages of those countries. France is the language of their colonizer. So kudos to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Um, and that also ties to, especially like with the Congo. Um, so actually, hold on. Slavevoyages.org. I just found out recently that they updated their database, and I think it's really cool because you could even look at, like, for example, you could even look up the names of enslaved African people and trace their origins. And, for example, if you look at, like, okay, so if you go on the website slavevoyages.org, if you scroll down and you go to African origins, there's a little sort of description, during the last during the last 60 years of the transatlantic slave trade, courts around the Atlantic basins condemned over 2,000 vehicles for engaging in the traffic and recorded the details of captives found on board, including their African names. Um, so basically, this is getting like the records of slave voyages, manifest and such. And if you click on African origins, if you click on learn more, you'll go to map. But then you can also go to, when you click on it, people. You can click on voyages. Um, Click on that. If you go through voyages, there's learn more. There's like what's also cool. They have like lesson plans. So as a teacher, I find it's really cool. There's like cool lesson plans that you can put in the school system. Um, you can click on people, find a person, click on time lapse. That gives you a time lapse of the volume of Africans being trafficked. And even on the time lapse, you can kind of change it from time lapse to map. So, and what it shows is the basically the pathways of different, basically where enslaved Africans were taken and where they landed. And so, like, you'll see particularly the Senegambia region, Sierra Leone region, Windward Coast. So that's like around. That's like around like almost Liberia to like Ivory Coast, I believe. Um, Sierra Leone, Windward Coast. Sorry, not Windrush. Windward Coast. The Gold Coast. That's Ghana. Bight of Benin. Bight of Biafra. So that's around Nigeria. Then you get to kind of around close to Nigeria, Cameroon region, West and Central Africa. Then you get further, and Benguela. I'm probably butchering that name, but actually, Neverondo, Luanda. Okay, Luanda. I know that's Angola. So is Benguela. That's also Angola. Now, there's other Congo River. Here we go. Congo River, Beira, Kalingo, Mayumba, Congo North. A lot of African people were taken from the Congo region as slaves to different parts of the Americas. So Angola to Brazil, that was a very common route. Same with the Congo. Um, and then you get to like Senegambia, Sierra Leone region. I'm just looking. So like you can see how you can even see the pathways from different parts of Africa to where enslaved African people were taken. And in the US from, the New York, New England area region to Virginia to the Carolinas, and most of the majority of African people were taken. Yeah. So like the Carolinas and Virginia were major places where Africans were dropped off, transported. And when you go from those regions and you go back, kind of trace it back a bit, you can see they'll come from like Sierra Leone, Senegambia, definitely Nigeria as well. I mean, there's these different routes, they kind of overlap with each other. But I think this is really fascinating. Um, but one thing it shows for sure is there were a lot of African people taken from the Congo and Angola region. And I think when we talk about what's going on in the Congo, I really think that we have to incorporate the damage that the transatlantic slave trade did to the African continent. The Congo being one example of that. But I think the update to slave voyages is really cool. I want to look at it even more and even do another episode on the slave voyages database. But I want to bring this to your attention because I think the update is really cool. Anyway, with that said, I've talked enough. It's already been an hour, so about an hour and 10 minutes, long enough for this episode. Anyway, if you like this episode, if you like Real Sankara Hours, what we're doing, patreon.com/Real Sankara Hours, become a patron for $5 a month. Within a couple days, I'm going to record another episode with Peter, and then there's a free episode that I'm going to unlock. But yeah, $5 a month. You can become a patron. You get exclusive content as a patron. You can also contribute to $3 a month. You don't get access to bonus content, but you're just like basically, to support the mission of what we're doing here. Basically promoting, news and political commentary from a Pan-African socialist perspective, Black-owned media. So yeah, if you become a patron, $5 a month or $3 a month, you can keep supporting what we're doing here at Real Sankara Hours. And I didn't completely want to talk about. Well, I was going to mention, but I mean, I didn't really have too much time to touch on it. But particularly as I'll just briefly mention it as I close out. Particularly as the Trump administration makes some efforts to censor the teaching of Black history, particularly going after museums for teaching Black history. This kind of independent Black media is only going to become more important, and that's another reason why we do what we do. And it's something that I really care about as well. It's something I want to keep doing because I think I believe in what we're doing. So yeah, if you support the mission of what we're doing here, and you want to support Black-owned media and, support another front in preserving Black history and resisting censorship of Black history. Yeah, support us. Like I said, $3 a month. You're just basically supporting You're supporting the podcast, but you don't get access to bonus content. $5 a month, you get access to bonus content. But the more you listen and the more you share, and also if you subscribe, like particularly if you're on YouTube, or elsewhere. Like that drives the algorithm and gets us noticed. So the more you listen, the more you share, the more you subscribe, the better. Even if you cannot support us financially, you can still support us by subscribing. Even if you're on YouTube, if you click like the bell icon to get notifications of when new videos are up, that supports us as well. So that supports us and also, helps us spread the message. So anyway, also our website, realsankarahours.org, you can find elsewhere to listen to us and support us. So anyway, that's it for this episode. Take care, y'all. Keep the faith. Stay dangerous. Love you.